And can you remind me again, what are the milestones that you are sort of looking forward to next when it comes to the Nakamoto release?
Yes, I think these, anyone who's been in the crypto industry would know that these are complicated distributed systems with all sorts of kind of like moving parts, right? So it's always very hard to predict when the system is going to launch. For people who have been in the community since the mainnet launch that happens in early 2021, I think there was the ongoing joke that so many people would ask, like, when mainnet? I think I bought the domain when mainnet and redirected it to GitHub, where people could like keep track of all the different moving parts. With that said, I think in the meetings, working group meetings that sometimes I'm part of, I'm sort of like telling people that one is the SBDC working group, which is looking at publishing a smart contract version of SBDC. So SBDC is going to be secured at the consensus level of Stacks L2. But the first step is that can you just publish it as a smart contract? So think of that as people who know operating systems, that changing the Linux kernel is always much harder. But if you secure something at the kernel, that's the highest level of security. But you can publish something at the application layer, and that's sort of like slightly easier, and you can test things out a little bit faster that way. So that's the plan with the first sort of like release, which is likely, I think, is going to be heavily capped because it's the first version. You don't want to put a lot of money on it, and it's not kind of like secure at consensus level as well. But in terms of most of the functionality, I think most of the functionality would be there when that happens, because the threshold signatures on Bitcoin would need to work, like people locking capital and being able to become signers would have to work. The full flow of someone depositing BTC on the L1 and getting their SBDC on the L2 and the way back would have to work. And I think that's a lot, right? So I think when that goes live, there are different names floating around. The current one is called SBDC Mini, but I think those names might change by the time this thing actually goes live. But that would be one sort of like a milestone that I would be keeping an eye on personally. And the second thing is the Nakamoto testnet, right? Because there are a bunch of upgrades happening on the consensus side, like the fast blocks, the higher security budget, Bitcoin security, all sorts of different improvements. And I think all of them are going to show up on a testnet. And when they show up on a testnet, that's when devs can actually do things against it. And then they can also start seeing a path that now we have the Nakamoto sort of like rules and implementation live on a testnet. Now we need to sort of like collapse SBDC at the consensus level. The way that would happen is for people who are deeper in the weeds and know how POX works. So SBDC would become part of the POX contract. It would likely be called POX4 or something like that. And then it's at the consensus level. So that would happen. And then there's the mainnet launch of the Nakamoto release, which I think would be a pretty big thing, not just in the Bitcoin industry, but in the broader industry as well. So I'm pretty sure a lot of people are probably watching when exactly that happens.
Awesome. Now, I would say that, we've been building in this open source ecosystem for a while. There have been people who have been on this journey with us. And so if you could just put it in just a sentence in terms of what you feel like makes the organization around Bitcoin Summer and the Nakamoto release different this time versus maybe the past couple of years of open source collaboration.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a revived interest in Bitcoin. And I think I've seen a bunch of these bear markets before. Usually in a bear market, people go back to more safe assets, and Bitcoin always feel more durable, something that's here to stay. But I think this time around, especially with so many blowups happening, the Luna crash and whatnot, I do think that there is a new crop of developers who are sort of like feeling like, look, Bitcoin is designed in a certain way. It's very simple. And then you can do a lot of things around the L2s. And I think the L2s, I still think they aren't like fully mature yet, but at least there's a path. There's a clear path. There are implementations of Lightning that are live. There is an implementation of Stacks that's live. There are major upgrades happening, and you can actually see the dev activity. So if you're a developer, you sort of like almost like see a path that we can have a very stable base layer, and then we can have like these really efficient, really fast L2s that can actually help growing the ecosystem. So I think that thing feels a little bit different right now. Like, for example, a couple of years ago, if you tell people that, hey, we're building on Bitcoin, it just felt like such a vague idea, because Bitcoin, most people would just think of it as a passive store of value, and not something where developers are doing interesting things and DeFi exists, or NFTs and other type of use cases exist.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I also wanted to dial into the urgency level, because it feels like there are a lot of application builders, people who want to build on Bitcoin L2s like stacks, and sort of, what makes the Nakamoto release and the progress that has been made toward it different versus some of the previous launches.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things here. I think this is a very important point. And the first thing I would say is that it takes a while for people to change their mindset a little bit. But I do think that there's a big difference between having a company that is maintaining software, even if it's open source, right? So outside of crypto, I'll take the example of Databricks, for example. It's a large company. It is a big contributor to Apache Spark. But a lot of people actually look to Databricks that, hey, they're doing most of the work. And yes, there are some open source developers who are helping as well. And in crypto, if it's a spectrum, right, maybe Solana Labs is an example. People look at Solana Labs and say that they will be doing, the bulk of the work on the software, and they're sort of like waiting on, hey, what are they going to do, right? Sure, I'm sure there are other contributors as well, but I'm just generalizing. I think in stacks, one thing to sort of like realize and really sort of digest and internalize is that there is no single company like that. There isn't, right? So if you're feeling that something is not moving fast enough, or something is sort of like broken, you have to turn around and say that there is no party on the other side. You're not just a consumer of a product that a company is building. You are the community, you are the ecosystem, and you have to self-organize. You have to sort of like show up. The basic structures are there. You have to show up on these working groups. If you have a business interest in something happening, you have to contribute resources, you have to roll up your sleeve, do the work. And I think the analogy there, the better fit is the Linux kernel. Like, there are a lot of companies that have a business interest in seeing the kernel stable and things shipped, but they have to learn how to work in an open source environment. So I think it takes a while. The last year, I would say, 6 months ago, things were definitely a lot more kind of like wobbly, and people just didn't know what's happening, and they just didn't fully realize like how to work in open source. And I've been personally spending a lot of time there because I'm just interested in that. Like, I've always been interested in open source software, decentralization, and I do think things are improving a lot, right? So, but here's the beauty of it. Once you get that right, there's this famous sort of like code that the most of the intelligent people in the world are not working for you in your company, right? They're actually outside. And if you open up your project like truly in a public way and a decentralized way for contributors around the world, I think then it just becomes something magical, right? Like, if you get that right, then you start picking momentum that a single company could probably never do that, right? So I think I see the project on that track, on that path. Obviously, a lot of work needs to be done. But I think if you do that well, it will be very powerful. With that said, I think you asked specifically about what's different between mainnet and now. I think one thing is just the raw number of contributors. Like, I think back in the mainnet time, it was launched under very different conditions. Like, there was basically one R&D labs like company that was doing the bulk of the work, and then the system decentralized when the mainnet launch happened. And it was maybe like 6-7 engineers or so. And now, as I said, that on these working groups, that like more than 40 people who are active, who show up to meetings, who write code, who are actually interested in contributing. So I think just the raw number of engineers is a big difference. And I think people are much better organized as well. Like, they've been running a consensus critical system for a couple of years. There's a lot of experience. There are people who have sort of, that knowledge has been shared a lot. Obviously, things can be improved, but I do think it just feels like a much mature sort of like an ecosystem that's working towards it.